Charlemagne. No other name so epitomizes the dawn of the European Middle Ages. He was king of the Franks and emperor of Western Christendom. Out of the turmoil of the early Middle Ages, he united the bulk of Western and Central Europe and laid the groundwork for the modern European world. Charles, a figure whose legend has grown through the centuries, was very much a real man, complex and fascinating. He was a patron of the arts and education, instigator of the flowering of learning, known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He was also a fierce conqueror who waged brutal wars to impose his domination on the Saxons, even going so far as to slaughter thousands of Saxon prisoners at the infamous massacre of Verdun. He faced defeats as well as victories, losing the rearguard of his army at the famous Battle of Roncesvalles, where he suffered a personal tragedy as well, losing his friend and companion in arms, Roland. Undeniably, Charlemagne is one of the key figures of the medieval world, and it's no surprise that he's often today remembered as the father of Europe. In this presentation, we will explore the life and career of Charlemagne. Toward the close of 753, Pope Stephen III traveled to France, the first pope in history to do so. The king of the Franks, Pepin, waited to greet the pope at Pontion. But in the meantime, he sent a party of horsemen to escort the Bishop of Rome as he made his way up the rugged, dangerous roads. Among Stephen's Frankish escort was a tall, blonde-haired boy of 11, Pepin's own son, Prince of the Franks, Charles. As Charles greeted the Pope with great reverence, and Stephen gave his hand to bless the prince and his men, the Pope could have had little idea that the lad before him would grow to be one of the most significant men in history, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, not only king, but emperor of the Franks, the architect of medieval Latin Christendom. In those days, France was on the periphery of Mediterranean civilization, overshadowed by the great Byzantine Empire to the east and the powerful Umayyad Caliphate that dominated the Mediterranean. But Charles's tribe, the Franks, already showed signs of toughness and political savvy. 2 decades earlier, Charles's own grandfather, Charles Martel, the Hammer, with a small army of grim, wolfskin-clad Franks, had crushed a massive Umayyad army on the battlefield of Tours. In an age when the armies of the Prophet seemed to vanquish every kingdom in their path, the Franks held firm. And in this prince who now greeted Pope Stephen would come to define a new age for Europe. The occasion of the Pope's visit was an appeal for aid. In Italy, the position of the Pope was threatened by Aistulf, a Lombard chieftain who demanded tribute from the papal coffers and acknowledgement of his rule in Ravenna. King Pepin called a meeting of the Frankish nobles to make a decision on war against the Lombards in defense of the Pope. The campaign was approved, and the Pope, in gratitude, re-anointed Pepin as king of the Franks, and anointed his sons Carloman and Charles as his successors. The Pope gave all 3 of them the title Patrician of the Romans, which seems to have indicated that they were to act as the special protectors of the Roman Church. This gives us a strong indication of the relationship that had developed and continued to evolve between the Frankish kings and the popes of Rome. Pepin was compared to David, the sword of God in defense of his people, while the Pope anointing him took the place of Samuel, the prophet, spiritual father of the faithful. In August, Pepin won a swift victory over Aistulf, who surrendered Ravenna to the papacy. By October, Pope Stephen was back in Rome, but his problems with the Lombards weren't over. Indeed, the popes would struggle with the Lombards for the remainder of Pepin's reign. On September 24, 768, Pepin died, having maintained his close alliance with the papacy throughout his reign. In accordance with Frankish law, the realm passed jointly to Pepin's sons, Charles and Carloman. However, in 771, Carloman died. The Franks assembled and ratified Charles as the sole ruler of the realm. Carloman's widow and 2 young sons fled to the Lombard court of King Desiderius, though Charles insisted that they had nothing to fear from him. Whatever the case, Charles now ruled the entirety of his father's kingdom. In 772, he launched an expedition against the Saxons, who had recently expelled and nearly killed the Anglo-Saxon missionary, Saint Lebwinus. Charles destroyed Irminsul, the sacred grove of the Saxons, with its treasures and shrines to the gods. In May of 773, the 35-year-old king held the National Assembly of the Franks at Geneva against the magnificent setting of the still blue lake and dark looming mountains. Here, Charles struck a regal figure as he presided over his people's convening. He was over 6 feet in height, strong and muscular in build, clad in a blue cloak with a gold-hilted sword at his belt. He had large piercing eyes, a long nose, and a strong neck. He moved easily among his people, an approachable, fatherly figure. He received gifts graciously, greeted the prominent men, chatted with those he'd not seen in a long time, showed respect and courtesy to the older men, relaxing and laughing with the younger men, and offering his attention to the clergy. Each morning he attended Mass, and each evening he went to Vespers. The primary occasion for this Frankish assembly echoed back to Charles's own youth. The king proposed once and for all to take decisive action against the Lombards in Italy. Desiderius, king of the Lombards, refused to surrender cities to Pope Hadrian that he'd promised to Pope Stephen III 16 years earlier. But what's more, Desiderius had also invaded the lands between Ravenna and Rome, specifically secured for the Pope by Charles's father. Only the threat of excommunication from Pope Hadrian stopped Desiderius from advancing on Rome itself. At first, Charles sought a peaceful solution, offering the Lombard king 14,000 gold solidi for the Italian cities. The Lombard refused. Indeed, Desiderius hoped to weaken Charles by pressuring the Pope into anointing the sons of Charlemagne as rightful Frankish kings. Given the situation, Charles easily secured the support of the Frankish assembly. War was declared. King Charles announced a 2-year Italian expedition. He hoped that by wintering in Italy, he could forever extinguish Lombard defiance. In the summer of 773, Charles led his army across the Alps. Lombard forces collapsed before him. There were only a few minor clashes, not even a battle. Cities submitted one after the other. The Duchy of Spaletto formally rejected Lombard overlordship and vowed allegiance to Pope Hadrian. In the fall, Charles besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, determined to accept nothing but total surrender. During Holy Week of 774, Charles traveled to Rome. He walked into St. Peter's on foot as a pilgrim and heard Mass on Easter at the Church of St. Mary. Charles then met with the Pope to discuss future policy. The Pope insisted that Charles confirm his father's donation of Pepin. Charles agreed and presented the Pope with a document to be placed in St. Peter's. By June, Desiderius was captured and taken to France as a prisoner, where he died. Charles took up the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself. In the midst of this victory, dramatic reports arrived from Germany. Many of the Saxon nobles collaborated with Charlemagne, accepting rewards in return for helping maintain Frankish power in Saxon territory. However, some of the Saxon warrior class determined to resist the Frankish occupation. Leading this group was Wittikind, a Saxon chieftain who could not be bought off. Wittikind has become legendary for his resistance to Charlemagne's rule. The Saxons that dwelt between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers to the north of Cologne launched counter-invasions into Frankish territory, raiding the region extensively. The news greatly disturbed Charlemagne. The Royal Frankish Annals from 775 describe his reaction. While the king spent the winter at the Villa of Quercy, he decided to attack the treacherous and treaty-breaking tribe of the Saxons, and to persist in the war until they were either defeated and forced to accept the Christian religion or entirely exterminated. Charles marched north at once. The Saxons fled before him, and he launched a counter-raid into Saxony. Members of the same Saxon tribe had long ago settled in England, becoming the Christian Anglo-Saxons. However, the Saxons in their ancestral home region of Germany remained strong in their traditional beliefs, pagan from the perspective of the Christians. In the winter of 775, Charles decided that he would put an end to his Saxon problem. He resolved to conquer all of Saxony and thereby secure his northeastern frontier. In 775, Charles invaded Saxony, penetrating from the Ruhr Valley across the Weser River close to Bremen. The Saxon chieftain, Wittekind, launched a surprise attack, but Charles defeated him and seized two important Saxon forts, or burgs. For 2 years, Charles returned annually to Saxony, meeting in assembly with the Saxon chieftains who swore loyalty to him, offering their property as surety. Many accepted baptism, but these conversions, made under duress to appease King Charles, often proved insincere. The Saxons would abandon the imposed religion of their conquerors as soon as the royal army withdrew and returned to their traditional belief system. Meanwhile, Wittekind refused to join in Charlemagne's assemblies and instead fled to Denmark, his wife's homeland. He intended to rally his people in resistance to Frankish domination. This is an early hint that the Viking Age of the 9th and 10th centuries, which saw many Scandinavian pagans invading Christian territory in Europe, may have been in some manner a reaction to Charlemagne's expansionism, though this idea is still controversial and widely debated among historians. Whatever the case, the Saxon pagans had interactions with the Scandinavians, who shared the same pantheon of gods. The second of Charlemagne's assemblies was held in 777 in northern Germany at Paderborn, close to the traditional Saxon-Frankish border. Once again, Charles appeared triumphant, with the Saxons submitting to him as well as to the Christian religion. Increasingly, Charles embraced his status as the most important Christian ruler west of Constantinople. Charles the Great, Charlemagne, the sword of Christendom. And so, he listened with interest when an ambassador arrived from Muslim Spain, a Moor called Suleiman, governor of the city of Barcelona. In the middle of the 8th century, events in the wider Muslim world had a dramatic impact on Islamic rule in Spain. The Umayyad dynasty, which had ruled Islam since 661, was overthrown in 750 by the Abbasids, who ruthlessly hunted down their rivals. However, one Umayyad, Abd al-Rahman, grandson of the Caliph Hisham, escaped the Abbasid swords. He fled across North Africa and then established contacts with his family's partisans in Spain. By August 755, al-Rahman was assembling an army and preparing to establish his power on the Iberian Peninsula. However, the current governor of Al-Andalus, Yusuf, was on the verge of establishing himself as an independent ruler. He had no intention of surrendering power to al-Rahman. The decisive encounter came when al-Rahman marched with an army on Cordoba. The two Muslim rivals met in battle outside the city on May 15, 756. Yusuf's army was destroyed. Abd al-Rahman marched triumphant into Cordoba, where he proclaimed himself emir. The era of an independent emirate of Cordoba had begun. Far more dangerous to Cordoba's power were independent Muslim lords in their frontier fortresses, especially in the northeast. Governors in Zaragoza, Barcelona, and Girona had long tried to hold Cordoba's authority at bay. Now they could proclaim the emir as an unlawful rebel against the Abbasid Caliph. Abbasid agents approached Suleiman, ruler of Zaragoza, who agreed to collaborate with them. Seeking other allies to bolster his rejection of Umayyad dominion, Suleiman even appealed to one of the major Christian powers of the era, Charlemagne, king of the Franks. Suleiman traveled to Paderborn, where he promised to submit Zaragoza to Frankish overlordship. Charlemagne welcomed this appeal. His concerns lay chiefly in Germany and Italy, but this seemed to be an opportunity for a quick success and expansion of his own power. Assembling his army, the Frankish king prepared to march out against the Umayyads and secure Zaragoza for his new Abbasid ally. In May 778, the Frankish army marched south and crossed the Pyrenees. After occupying Pamplona, Charlemagne moved on Zaragoza, but the city gates remained closed to him. Husayn ibn Yahya, Suleiman's lieutenant left in charge of the city, reneged on Suleiman's terms and chose to resist the Franks. Although Charlemagne's army was not equipped for a long siege, the Franks did make an attempt on the city. Zaragoza held out. Charlemagne at last gave the order to withdraw, destroying Pamplona on his way back. On August 15, 778, Charlemagne's army was at Roncesvalles. Thick forests covered the jagged hillsides. So narrow was this pass that the Frankish army was strung out for miles in thin columns. From the ledges above, a force of Basques hid and watched. They waited until twilight, when the bulk of the army had moved through the pass, then fell upon the rearguard, peppering them with boulders and arrows. As the rearguard broke in confusion and was separated from the main army, the Basques rushed upon them. Though the Franks stood and fought fiercely, the Basques overwhelmed them. It was in this ambush that died Roland, lord of the Breton marches. Roland's heroism at this impossible moment would become the stuff of a legend in European literature. By the time Charlemagne realized what had happened, it was over, and the Basques had vanished into the night. The epic Song of Roland records Charlemagne's lament over the loss of his friend and comrade. "My friend Roland, God lay your soul on flowers, in paradise with all the glorious host. You came to Spain with a cruel overlord. No day shall pass henceforth that I'll not mourn." Charlemagne's Iberian Campaign was a rare disappointment in his long career of triumphs. Abd al-Rahman benefited the most from it. After the departure of the Franks, Husayn killed Suleiman, just before Abd al-Rahman arrived with a vast Umayyad army to subdue Zaragoza. Once the city fell, Husayn was dragged before the emir and executed for rebellion. Zaragoza became the emir of Cordoba's most important northern fortress. In the autumn of 780, Charlemagne returned to Italy, holding court at Pavia. In the spring of 781, he settled on a marriage agreement with the Byzantine Empress Irene at Constantinople. Irene's 10-year-old son Constantine was betrothed to Charles's daughter Rotrud, age 8. The Byzantines also agreed to withhold their support from the exiled King Desiderius of the Lombards, who had just tried to take refuge at Constantinople. This was a striking development. The Franks were now negotiating as equals with the ancient Byzantine Empire of Eastern Rome. In earlier times, this would have been impossible, but now Charlemagne's empire was coming to rival the great powers of the Mediterranean. Close to Easter of that year, Charlemagne was introduced to an Anglo-Saxon scholar, Alcuin of York, at Parma, Italy. Alcuin was in Italy on a diplomatic mission, and Charlemagne was deeply impressed by his intellect and learning. The Frankish king asked Alcuin to join him at his own court to direct the royal school, where the royal princes and the sons of the Frankish nobility would be educated. In addition, Charles wanted Alcuin to lead a general effort to elevate the intellectual standards of Frankish society. At the time, Alcuin was director of the library and school of the cathedral at York. Anglo-Saxon England had long been a center of Latin learning, and the literary arts were flourishing there under scholars like Alcuin. At first, he was reluctant to leave all this behind, but he also understood the importance of the task Charles had laid out before him. He agreed to Charlemagne's proposal and relocated to the Frankish court. There, Alcuin would play a central role in the Carolingian Renaissance, which saw the preservation and study of many important ancient books and elevated education throughout Western Europe. Amid this new flowering of learning, the brutal Saxon wars slogged on. In 782, the Saxons once again rebelled against Frankish rule and even won a victory against their Frankish enemies at the Battle of Suntul. The Saxon forces on this occasion were led by Wittikind, a charismatic figure who inspired zeal to resist in his fellow tribesmen. At the time, a Frankish army not led by Charles, but led by some of his high-ranking nobles, was moving through Saxon territory on an expedition against the pagan Slavs. Wittikind ambushed the Frankish camp near the mountain of Suntul. The Frankish camp was almost entirely annihilated. Meanwhile, a detachment of Frankish cavalry was out on patrol, and Wittikind managed to lure them into a trap, using his archers to mow down the Frankish horsemen. It was a spectacular victory for the Saxons. When Charlemagne heard news of this defeat, he was furious. He rushed to Saxony, where he promptly quashed this brief Saxon triumph. In a rage, the Frankish king ordered the massacre of 4,500 Saxon noblemen at Verdun on a single day in 782. This act has gone down in history as a stain on the career of Charlemagne. Historians have long debated the circumstances of the massacre and Charlemagne's own attitude about the deed. Some historians have argued that Charles regretted this brutal act, while others have suggested that it was a cold-blooded but effective tactic which greatly reduced the ability of the Saxons to resist. But there is no evidence that Charles ever repented publicly of this deed. In 785, Charlemagne's most resourceful opponent, the untiring and courageous Wittekind, finally submitted and accepted baptism. Pope Adrian proclaimed a 3-day festival of thanksgiving throughout the Frankish Empire. Saxony was now considered to be a part of Christendom. However, Frankish rule was harsh. Charles decreed the death penalty for any Saxons who violated church law, practiced their own funerary rites, or damaged churches. All the while, Charlemagne's empire consolidated its hold over other regions. By this point, the Franks occupied a small northerly sliver of what is today Spain, a piece of territory in the southern foothills of the Pyrenees. Here, the Franks established a series of highly militarized and self-governing counties to act as defensive buffers against the Umayyad Moors of Spain. This was the logical continuation of the policy of Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, who had halted Moorish incursions into France. Thus began the early medieval history of Catalonia. Meanwhile, the Frankish Church grew increasingly important in matters of ecclesiastical affairs. In 791, a council of Frankish bishops met in Narbonne to consider the theological concept of adoptionism. Promoted by Bishop Felix Vergel, adoptionism held that Christ was the adopted Son of God. The Frankish bishops joined the Pope in condemning the concept as heresy. A synod held the following year in Ratisbon by Charlemagne denounced Bishop Felix, who fled to Muslim Spain rather than abandon his teachings. In response to the controversy, Pope Hadrian issued a document called The Churches of Spain and Galicia, in which he specified that the church in Christian-held Spain should be treated separately from the church in Muslim-held Spain, the former being free, the latter being in bondage, and perhaps prone to error due to the influence of Moorish rule. As in Saxony, the Pope looked to the Franks as the ultimate key to the church's triumph in Spain. The Frankish outposts in Catalonia would be the first step toward an eventual Frankish conquest of the Emirate of Córdoba. However, the Umayyads weren't willing to let Catalonia go so easily. In 793, Hisham I, the new emir of Muslim Spain, launched a well-executed attack on the Frankish counties, driving right into the Pyrenees. Duke William Crookednose of Toulouse, one of Charlemagne's most celebrated commanders, suffered defeat in battle. The Umayyads sacked the region as far as Narbonne before withdrawing home loaded with booty. Hisham's death in 796 allowed Alfonso II, the Christian king of Asturias in northern Spain, to bounce back. In 797, Alfonso dispatched an embassy to Charlemagne, proposing an alliance between the Franks and the Christian kingdom of Asturias. Alfonso's men presented Charles with a beautifully embroidered tent captured from the Muslims. Charles expressed his support, though ultimately Spain never seemed to become a top priority for the Frankish king. In 798, Alfonso raided deep into Moorish territory as far as Lisbon and sent some of the booty to his Frankish ally. Alfonso's attitude toward the Franks further highlights how widely Charlemagne was recognized as the most important monarch in Western Christendom. By 798, his empire was sprawling. The whole of Saxony, west of the Elbe, was now firmly under his control. The Slavic tribes on his eastern border had been subdued and made tributary. Even the Avar horsemen of Hungary had been defeated and their leaders baptized. England, too, was now heavily influenced by Charles the Great, with Frankish churchmen being dispatched to participate in English councils. During this period, Pope Hadrian died, replaced by Pope Leo III in 795. Leo wasted no time encouraging Charles to continue his role as champion of the Roman Church. Charlemagne responded with a strong expression of agreement. It is for us, in accordance with the help of divine goodness, outwardly to defend by force of arms the holy Church of Christ in all places from incursions of pagans and the ravages of infidels, and inwardly to fortify her with our confession of the Catholic faith. At Aachen, Charlemagne established his chief residence where the German and Frankish languages met. Here, the king built a new city and a lavish palace to serve as his royal capital. Already his legend was growing, and the idea that he would be a new emperor for Christendom began to take shape. A German poem from 799 describes him as father of Europe and likened him to Caesar Augustus. Paulinus of Aquileia described him as ruler of all Christians, and Alcuin habitually referred to him as a new David. Leo was not so competent as his predecessor. Pope Hadrian had hailed from the Roman aristocracy, and his political savvy allowed him to master the turbulent politics of central Italy. But Leo had been a humble clerk from the papal treasury. He was determined and pious, but not a natural leader. Certain factions of Rome's elite resented him as base-born, and even charged him with sexual impropriety. In April of 799, a nephew of the late Pope Hadrian, Pascal, and the papal bursar Campulus carried out a brutal plot against Leo III. While leading a procession through the street, a gang of men attacked Pope Leo. They threw him to the ground, stripped him, and attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue. The Pope was left lying bloody in the streets, while his unarmed attendants fled through the alleys of Rome. Pascal and Campulus's men dragged the injured Leo into the church of St. Sylvester, where they proclaimed him deposed and again slashed his eyes and tongue. He was then imprisoned in the Greek monastery of St. Erasmus. However, that night, the Pope's chamberlain Albinus snuck into the monastery and rescued the Pope by lowering him down the wall on a rope. Albinus had the Pope carried swiftly to St. Peter's, where it was discovered that Leo, despite his injuries, could still see and speak. Albinus and the Pope's allies rejoiced, certain that this was a miracle. The Duke of Spaletto, an agent of Charlemagne who provided a military force for the Pope, sent word of the attack to the King of the Franks. Charlemagne asked that Pope Leo be sent to him at Paderborn. Charles's son, Prince Pepin, and the Archbishop of Cologne accompanied the Pope on his journey until Charlemagne greeted him at Paderborn. Charles greeted the Pope warmly and promised to punish the conspirators behind the attack. The scene of Charlemagne's greeting of the Pope must have been striking. The whole of the Frankish army, fresh from its victories over the Saxons, was assembled. There were trumpet blasts and shields and spears flashing in the summer sun. Prince Pepin guided the Pope through the lanes of soldiers to where Charles stood awaiting him gloriously in the midst of his highest nobles and bishops. The king was clad in his finest armor, a golden helmet on his head. Charles knelt to receive Pope Leo's blessing, then embraced him. Side by side, they entered the church, where the Pope offered Mass. Afterward, a lavish banquet was held, in which wine was served in golden goblets. One longs to know the private discussions that took place between Charles and the Pope on this occasion. Surely Charles promised the Pope to clear his name and reinstate him in Rome. But also, the two may well have planned for the magnificent coronation ceremony that would soon take place in Rome. No one questioned Charlemagne's right to demand that the Pope be sent to him. By now, Charles had been ruling for some 30 years, and he was widely known as Charles the Great. The intellectuals at his court marveled that this Frankish prince, who had inherited only half of Frankland, now reigned from the Atlantic shores in the west to the Bohemian wilderness in the east, and from the northern fringe of Spain all the way to the Elbe River in the north, from Calabria in the south of Italy to the frontiers of Denmark. From this vast empire, immense wealth as well as prestige flowed into the king's possession. But like any capable ruler, he nurtured more than military power. He grasped the importance of spiritual goods, cultivating schools and the arts, reforming the church, and bestowing on his people a new system of coinage designed to improve trade throughout his vast lands. Even in the realm of faith, Charles seemed to go beyond the Pope himself, often taking the lead in attacking heresy. Alcuin, no mere court flatterer, described Charles as illumined with the light of all knowledge and wise enough to see through all that is mystery and darkness. It helped that Alcuin was among the highest circle of the royal court, whose advice was most prized by the king. Charles would listen to Alcuin, especially in matters of great importance. So now, when this fiasco involving Pope Leo arose, Charles turned to Alcuin for counsel. The motivations for this plot against the Pope are complex, but do shed some light on the political realities of the period. For one, many members of the Roman aristocracy took issue with Leo because he had been the nominee endorsed by the Frankish Church, effectively Charlemagne's preferred candidate. Some of the Roman nobility were increasingly uncomfortable with the growing power of the Franks, and for them, Leo represented the acceleration of that power. Historian Geoffrey Barraclough even speculates that Pascal and Campulus were in touch with the imperial government at Constantinople, a natural ally to anyone hoping to counter the power of the Franks. Alcuin urged Charles to dismiss the charges against the Pope, and to support him in no uncertain terms. Alcuin was convinced that the charges of adultery and perjury against the Pope must be false. We can still read Alcuin's letter of advice to Charlemagne on the matter of this scandal. Hitherto, there have been 3 persons in the highest position in the world. The first was that apostolic sublimity who rules as the vicar in the chair of St. Peter, and you have informed me of what has been done to him. The second is the imperial dignity and secular power of the Second Rome, Constantinople, and everyone is talking about how impiously its emperor has been deposed, not by foreigners, but by his own fellow citizens. The third is the royal dignity in which you have been placed by the dispensation of our Lord Jesus Christ, so that you are ruler of the Christian people. Your power is more excellent than theirs, your wisdom more shining, your royal dignity more sublime. Behold, upon you alone rests the salvation of the churches of Christ. We can see how Alcuin urged Charles to understand the gravity of his own responsibility. The good of the Christian order in the world lay squarely on the king's shoulders. Alcuin also gives us some insight into prevailing Western views of the situation in the old Eastern Roman Empire at this time. In Constantinople, the seat of Eastern Rome, the Empress Irene had been regent from 780 to 790, during which period she was guardian to her minor son, Constantine VI. When he came of age, Irene initially showed her support and allowed him to take up power, but she then entered into conspiracy against him, and in 797, her thugs kidnapped the lad and blinded him on the orders of his own mother. Irene then announced herself to be emperor, not empress. For Charles, Alcuin, and other members of the Frankish court, this was the height of evil and disorder. Irene, who had mutilated her own son, could never be rightful ruler. But furthermore, as a woman, she also could not be emperor. For the Franks, the Roman Empire was vacant. One can see where all this was leading. The Franks, including Charles himself, had very strong opinions about who it was that should take up the title of emperor. Meanwhile, Charles acted to settle the Papal Scandal. In October, he sent Pope Leo back to Rome, along with a 10-man commission to inquire about the charges made against him. The Pope was also escorted by a large body of Frankish warriors to remind the Romans that it was Charles and no other who would determine the outcome of this matter. The commission gathered for the hearings. The Pope's accusers again leveled their charges, but Alcuin argued that it was improper for the Holy Pontiff to be subjected to earthly judgment. To solve the issue, Pope Leo himself agreed to swear an oath that the charges were false. Meanwhile, the Pope's accusers were sent back to Frankland to face Charles himself. In March of 800, Charlemagne set out on a tour of his empire from the Straits of Dover to the Spanish frontier. He was investigating reports of recent attacks along these shores by Norse seafarers, Vikings as we call them today. These were among the first stirrings of the Viking Age, which would come to a head well after Charlemagne's death. To counter this growing problem, Charles constructed a fleet to patrol his coastlines. He dispatched a Frankish force to occupy the Balearic Islands off the coast of Catalonia in modern Spain. At this point, under Charlemagne's sound and united government, there was little opportunity for Viking raiders. Later, with the decay of the Carolingian order under Charlemagne's successors, there would be plenty. For now, Charlemagne's vast empire afforded a great deal of stability and tranquility for the bulk of its inhabitants. we can see why scholars at the Frankish court were tempted to believe that the old Pax Romana had returned. At Tours, Charles the Great held a meeting with all three of his sons, along with Alcuin, the new abbot of St. Martin's. Charlemagne spent May in prayer, perhaps preparing for the momentous event that was about to take place. Around this time, Charles's fifth and final wife, Luitgard, died suddenly. Our sources describe him mourning for her bitterly, but this did not stop him from announcing in August that he would travel to Rome to see to the affairs of the papacy and of his Italian kingdom. Charles arrived in Rome in November, accompanied by a large army and an abundance of gifts for the churches of the city. There was still grumbling in the streets about Pope Leo among certain factions of the Roman nobility. But on the 23rd of December, in the presence of King Charles, Pope Leo took an oath, swearing to the falsehood of the charges of Pascal and his other accusers. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, 800, crowds of Romans, Franks, Bavarians, Lombards, Goths, Basques, and even some visiting Anglo-Saxons and Greeks, all packed into the great cathedral of St. Peter's. Near the front of the altar stood Charles's sons and daughters, the royal Frankish princes and princesses. At the front of the altar stood Charles himself, garbed in a Roman tunic and cloak, with a belt of gold and jeweled sandals. In the midst of Mass, Pope Leo crowned Charlemagne as emperor. The gathered crowd cried out in proclamation of the coronation. Long life and victory to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and pacific emperor of the Romans. The Pope then prostrated himself before Charles and kissed the hem of his cloak in the ancient ritual of the Roman Empire. Charles Winston points out that this procedure, acclamation by the Roman people, was the proper legal form for proclaiming a Roman emperor. Thus, Charles became Emperor of the West, the first since AD 476. There has been much debate about the circumstances of Charlemagne's coronation, but for Charlemagne's council of nobles, abbots, and bishops, this was the logical development. For them, the true original empire was Roman, while the empire based in Constantinople no longer had any connection to Rome, and indeed was now ruled by a woman who could never be a military commander. The old Roman Empire of the West, including Rome, Ravenna, Milan, Arles, Lyon, Paris, and Trier, were now joined together again under Charlemagne's rule. He was de facto emperor. He should be proclaimed emperor by law. There is strong reason to believe that this was exactly how Charlemagne himself viewed things, and that he pursued this outcome in his policy. Today, there is much debate about Charlemagne's coronation, much of it sparked by Charles's own court biographer, Einhard. Einhard wrote that Charlemagne was so surprised and annoyed by the Pope's crowning him that he would never have entered the church if he'd known about Leo's intention. This statement flatly contradicts all of Charlemagne's own actions in the previous months as he prepared for this momentous event. The notion that Charles was not expecting to receive the imperial title is simply beyond belief. Historians have offered many explanations for Einhard's bizarre comment. Perhaps Charlemagne wanted the imperial rank but didn't want to receive it from the Pope, which would imply that the Pope was a higher authority. The problem with this explanation is that it's potentially anachronistic, looking forward to conflicts between the popes and the emperors in the 11th century that did not yet exist in the 9th century. Another theory is that Charles did not want to be proclaimed emperor until he'd received approval from the Byzantine emperor in the East. Certainly, in the coming years, Charles would strive to win the recognition of the Eastern Emperor, even making considerable concessions to earn the acknowledgement of his brother emperor. But Charles could never have expected Constantinople to recognize him as emperor voluntarily. Surely a savvy politician like Charlemagne knew that he must first gain the title and then bargain for the grudging approval of the Byzantine emperors. Frankish policy certainly supports this thesis. Other historians have posited that Einhard simply wanted to portray his master as modest, refusing the imperial title until it was positively imposed on him. Another explanation is that he may have been revealing his own bias, as he, like many Franks, preferred to think of Charles as a Frankish king, not as a Roman emperor. The jealousy felt by Franks of the noble class at the thought of their emperor expanding beyond his tribal kingship was very real, and might explain Einhard's strange remark. In the Germanic tradition, a chieftain's high-ranking men acclaimed him their leader, not a Roman pope. Charlemagne's ascension represented the final death of the old Germanic legal assembly, where free men gathered together, their chieftain the first among equals. Now, the Franks would kneel before a man who was not only their tribal leader, but a universal emperor. Whatever the truth behind Einhard's famous utterance, Charles the Great was now emperor, and he exercised his powers at once. He dispatched his agents throughout the papal territories, collecting taxes and taking oaths of allegiance from the local magnates. He had coins struck which proclaimed the restoration of the empire, and even contemplated a marriage with the Byzantine Empress Irene. There can be no question that Charles cast his ascension as a new era of greatness to rival that of Caesar Augustus. We get an insight into Charlemagne's conception of his empire from an oath of loyalty he required within his domain in the year 802. Charlemagne obliged all free men to swear a personal oath of loyalty to him and to his laws. He also asked each man to swear to voluntarily strive according to his intelligence and strength to keep himself entirely in the holy service of God and to never bring any harm to churches, widows, orphans, or strangers, all regarded by Charles as being under his special guardianship. Charlemagne placed the church's canon law alongside his own law. Both had to be obeyed. In October of 802, the emperor held a great assembly at which both civil and canon law were proclaimed, expanded, and codified. Meanwhile, in that same year, Charlemagne's dream of uniting the empires of West and East by marriage came to an absolute end. The Byzantine Empress Irene was overthrown in Constantinople by her treasurer and exiled to the island of Lesbos, where she soon died. The treasurer became Emperor Nicephorus I. Irene had been more affable towards Charlemagne's court, but Nicephorus was adamantly opposed to the Frankish ruler. However, Charles and Nicephorus had to deal with one another, for at this point, their empires shared frontiers. Charles extended an olive branch to Nicephorus, offering peace on the borderlands in exchange for recognition as Western Emperor. To apply a little pressure to the Byzantines, Charles exchanged embassies with their greatest enemy, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, ruler of the vast Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliph sent Charles exotic gifts, the most spectacular being an elephant named Abul Abbas. At the time, an elephant was a thing of true wonder for the Franks. Charles used to take the animal with him as he journeyed around his empire, and Abul became a favorite attraction for both nobles and commoners. The Caliph sent the Franks a beautiful mechanical clock with 12 windows from which figurines of armored warriors marched forth with the striking of each hour. But these negotiations produced more than fancy gifts. Al-Rashid granted Charles special status as protector of the Christians in the Holy Land. Charles received the keys to the Holy Sepulchre and even to Jerusalem itself. As a fervent Christian, Charles showed an active concern for the affairs of the Holy Land and its Christian inhabitants. Perhaps this could be regarded as the first stirring that would one day culminate in the First Crusade, conducted by Charlemagne's Frankish descendants. During this period, Charles was intensely active in tending to domestic affairs. He strove to protect the poor, widows, and orphans within his empire, and he urged the clergy to stick to their vows and act toward the good of the Christian people. Many of Charlemagne's decrees during this period have a strong religious tone, and the emperor himself almost sounds like a pope or a bishop. He urged his people to be not quarrelsome, not wrathful, not proud, not drunken, but chaste in heart and body, humble, modest, sober, merciful, peaceful. Charles strove to lessen military obligations for the poor. Poorer freemen were exempted from military service. This was possible because the vast bulk of Charles's domain was now at peace, with only the frontiers being active zones of combat. On the one hand, an empire can provide such stability. On the other, it requires long years of bloodshed to achieve. But to Charlemagne's Christian subjects, it must have been a sort of golden age. But not everyone living under Frankish rule felt content. In Saxony, unrest continued. This is not surprising, given the harshness of Frankish rule. The penalty for any Saxon violating a Christian principle was death, even for eating meat during Lent or cremating the dead in the old traditional fashion. To strengthen Christian power in Saxony, Charles gave the clergy the right to absolve anyone guilty of violating Frankish law, making the priests and bishops virtually absolute in their power over life and death for ordinary people. This was an obvious formula for abuse of power. To rub salt in the wound, the Saxons, already impoverished by decades of war, had to pay taxes for the upkeep of Christian churches that Charles forced them to build. Thus, after 3 decades of virtually endless war, Saxon guerrillas continued to resist Frankish domination. The memory of Verdun still burned fiercely in many Saxon hearts, and at every opportunity, bands of Saxon warriors would ambush Frankish convoys and slay imperial envoys and priests. As one indignant Frankish chronicler put it, the Saxons, like dogs, return always to their own vomit. For the Saxons, however, this was justified retaliation against a brutal oppressor, and their traditional beliefs were cherished banners of resistance. Now, in his 60s, Charlemagne personally led one of his final military campaigns, once again marching into Saxony at the head of a large army. He called on his Slavic allies to help in quashing the Saxons. As usual, the Saxon guerrillas melted before the full power of a Frankish army. This time, Charles didn't perform a mass execution. Instead, he ordered the dispersal of the Saxon peoples throughout his empire. The Slavs received one whole region of Saxony for their service, and vast tracts of Saxony were virtually depopulated. By scattering thousands of Saxon men, women, and children throughout his vast lands, and thus breaking their ability to live together and maintain their traditional bonds, Charles at last broke Saxon resistance. Saxony had been pacified and Christianized after 3 decades of unremitting brutality. Today, it's difficult to quantify the human cost, but it was undeniably immense. The brutality of Charlemagne the Conqueror contrasts sharply with Charles the family man. From our own source material, it seems that the emperor enjoyed spending time with his wife and children, which isn't necessarily a given among monarchs. He was married at least 4 times, outliving several wives, and had many concubines. Charles's favorite wife seems to have been his last, Luitgard, famed for her beauty and poise. Charles took his wife and children with him as he journeyed throughout his vast domain, and they would join him for hunting expeditions. After a hunt, Charles would settle in with his family, his Frankish warriors, and his court clergymen to enjoy a meal of the game killed in the chase. During the meal, one of the household scholars, such as Alcuin or Engelbert, might rise to recite a poem or work of literature. Some of Charles's gruffer warriors groaned at this, but they knew not to argue with the emperor, who deeply prized the literary arts. There was little heavy drinking in the hall of Charlemagne, for he despised drunkenness. He preferred instead, as Alcuin put it, the wine of learning. At dinner, he also enjoyed hearing the reading of histories, or Augustine's City of God, his favorite book, which he pondered and discussed at length with his court scholars. Charlemagne doted on his daughters. The court poet Engelbert gives a striking description of Charlemagne's daughters enjoying a hunt with their father's court. There was Rotrud, Charlemagne's favorite, her pale blonde hair intertwined with ribbons of violet and strings of pearls, a coronet of gold circling her head. Next came the lovely Bertha, wearing a golden diadem with golden filaments sparkling in her gleaming hair, her snowy shoulders covered by an ermine wrap, her belt shining in many colors. Then there was lily-white Gisla, apparelled in a purple gown shot through with mauve, her face, her hair gleaming with many lights. Even the teenage Theotrid was clad in rare emeralds, adorning her lovely neck. Charlemagne's daughters were well educated and accompanied their father along with their brothers at various processions, feasts, and hunts. As the fame of their beauty and grace spread, many foreign rulers tried to arrange marriage matches with Charles the Great's daughters. Even the Byzantine emperor wanted Charlemagne to send him a daughter for a marriage alliance, the ultimate prestige. However, Charlemagne refused. No matter how many offers he received, Charlemagne would not allow his daughters to marry. Why is this? Well, the short answer is, if they'd married, they would have had to have left home. But why didn't Charlemagne want his daughters to leave home? Einhard, Charlemagne's court biographer, gives us an answer. He states that the old emperor was so fond of his daughters that he simply could not part from them. Some historians, preferring political motivations to personal, have rejected this. But we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss Einhard's insights. There's probably a great deal of truth in Einhard's statement. After all, Charlemagne did have his daughters with him as often as he could, but there may also have been a broader purpose to Charlemagne's policy here. In refusing to allow his daughters to marry, he prevented the formation of foreign cadet branches to his dynasty. This prevented future competition for Frankish lands. Charles spent his reign building a vast empire, and he did not want it destroyed in a storm of familial conflict. Already he was worried, for his sons were set to each inherit a portion of his empire, in keeping with Frankish tradition. He wanted them to reign as brother kings, acting together rather than as rivals. This was a tall order, but throwing in grandsons from foreign kingdoms, trying to grab a piece of the empire, would only further complicate things. Janet Nelson points out that Charles's daughters served another important function. They gave their father political help with the household and the court. They were channels of patronage he could control and sources of information he needed. They were capable and trusted advisors and supporters. Although they never married sacramentally, Charles's daughters did take what we might anachronistically call today common law husbands, high-ranking noblemen loyal to their father. One of these men was Engelbert, the poet mentioned earlier, who was a loyal agent of Charlemagne throughout his life. Engelbert was the husband of Bertha. From these partnerships came many grandchildren, and Charlemagne's palace was soon filled with rambunctious youngsters calling him grandfather. Charles embraced all of these children, and he enjoyed being their grandfather all the more because none of them could possibly pose a future challenge to his heirs. During this early period in medieval Europe, old traditions of the Germanic tribes often lingered alongside the Christian law. In this environment, there might be a layered idea to marriage. On the one hand, Christian sacramental marriage was required for official standing, for the bearing of heirs, and for the making of political matches. But in more intimate circles, earlier, more tribal ideas of marriage might persist. We will see this manifest later in the age of Duke Robert of Normandy, father of William the Conqueror, who took as his companion Herleva, regarded in many ways as his wife by the Norman warrior elite, though he never married her sacramentally in the Christian church. This dynamic may be at play in the matter of Charlemagne's daughters.
Toward the close of his reign, Charlemagne was surely proud of what he'd built. He'd turned the kingdom of the Franks into an empire and was crowned as Roman emperor by the Pope in Rome. But as he aged, Charles must have felt some anxiety about the future of his domain. Would his descendants be able to keep what he'd won? Would his empire endure? Today, we'll learn about the final years of Charlemagne and the forecast for his son and heir, Louis the Pious. In early 806, Charles the Great convened with his sons at his capital of Aachen. With his heirs assembled before the Frankish lords, nobles, and clergymen, the emperor announced his final will. The chronicler Einhard carried a copy of the will to Pope Leo to be witnessed by the pontiff and proclaimed in Rome. The published document affirmed the status quo. Frankish custom dictated that a ruler grant a realm to each of his sons, and Charles had done just this long ago. Now an emperor, Charles likely regretted this earlier decision to divide his realm, but by now there was little he could do to change it. His sons already ruled in their own sub-kingdoms, and any attempt to alter this arrangement would surely result in civil war. In his will, Charles stressed endlessly that his sons must keep peace with one another and rule together as loving brothers. He insisted that this was the very command of God. They must allow their subjects to travel and marry freely across their borders, and above all, they must not war with one another. Charles also instructed his sons to protect the church. However, at the close of the first decade of the 9th century, plague swept through Italy and Central Europe, and word arrived that the Danes planned to attack Charles's empire. Expecting a Danish invasion, Charles led his army to Verden in 810, the very site of his massacre of the Saxons years earlier. The curse of Verden seemed to haunt the aging emperor, for here he received word that his beloved daughter, Rotrud, had died of plague. Also, Charles lost his sister, Gisla. The emperor grieved deeply. Did he wonder if this was punishment for his harsh treatment of the Saxons? Worse was to follow. Still at Verden, Charles received news that his son Pepin had died. Meanwhile, throughout the empire, cattle began to perish of some strange illness. Even the elephant Abul Abbas succumbed to the ailment. Ultimately, the Danish invasion never materialized, but As Charles and his army marched home, a meteor flashed across the sky. The emperor's horse shied and threw its rider to the ground, causing him to lose his sword and his cloak. Einhard wrote he was disarmed and disrobed, making it clear that he saw the fall as a dark portent. Finally, in December of 811, young Charles also died. Grief seemed to endlessly assail the old emperor. Only one of his sons remained, Louis. Although he'd governed Aquitaine since his boyhood, Louis was the least capable of Charlemagne's sons. He preferred prayer to politics, and this earned him the title Louis the Pious. But Charles was convinced that Louis could maintain the unity of his empire and affirmed that Louis and no other would inherit the crown. Meanwhile, the aging Charlemagne sought solace in God. He discussed doctrine with the clergy, prepared a text of the four Gospels, and donated the bulk of his personal fortune to the church. Now in his 70s, he began to suffer fevers and gout. He often withdrew to his private chamber, too ill to hold court. However, in 812, when ambassadors from the Byzantine Empire arrived at Aachen, Charles greeted them personally. This visit concluded years of negotiation between the two empires. In return for a treaty of peace in which the Franks relinquished Venetia and Dalmatia, the Byzantines agreed to recognize Charlemagne's imperial title. At this point, Charles conferred on his son, Louis, the title of emperor. Throughout this period, the emperor kept Louis at his side, instructing him in the art of governance. Louis was 35, married with children of his own. Charles strove not only to educate his son in political matters, but also to impart to him the virtues of a good life, so that he might always conform himself to the laws of God. In September of 813, Charles assembled his dukes, counts, bishops, and abbots for the coronation of Louis as emperor. Charles arrayed himself in his imperial robes, which he'd rarely worn since his own coronation. Holding to Louis's arm for support, he approached the altar of his great church at Aachen. On the altar sat a magnificent crown, akin to the crown that had awaited Charles 13 years prior in the Basilica of St. Peter. Louis and his father knelt together in prayer. At last, the emperor rose. He turned to face the assembly and launched into a speech, which turned into a long sermon. Like a priest-king, Charles preached to his son to love God, to guard the church, to treat his family well, to honor the clergy, and to protect the common people, to provide for widows, orphans, and the poor. Louis voiced his resolve to abide by his father's wishes. Then, Charlemagne placed the crown on his son's head. Raising the young man to his feet, Charles embraced him. Louis, like his father, was now emperor. Interestingly, Charles did not ask the Pope or a bishop to perform this coronation. Does this reveal something about his attitude toward his own crowning? Is this proof that Einhard was right, that Charlemagne did not approve of the Pope having been the one to actually crown him? Perhaps Charles was concerned that the Church might try to set the precedent of its own superiority over the authority of the Emperor. Or perhaps this interpretation is anachronistic, looking ahead to later clashes between Emperor and Pope. Perhaps Charles simply didn't even consider that a clergyman was needed for the crowning. What authority could be higher than the Emperor? It's difficult to separate later developments from this moment in the 9th century, especially given the tremendous conflict that ultimately developed between church and state. We can be certain, however, that the coronation of Louis by Charles himself certainly reflects the emperor's own perception of authority in his empire. Emperor crowning emperor, father crowning son, nobles and bishops looking on from the assembly. Louis's coronation was the final public act of Charlemagne. After this, he recovered his old vigor for a time and spent October indulging in the hunt. But that winter, he again fell ill. In January of 814, he suffered a fever, which soon affected his lungs. On the 28th, Charlemagne died, having reigned as one of the most significant monarchs in history. He was 71. His family and followers interred him in the church he'd built at Aachen. Louis took the throne unopposed, but his reign would not at all resemble his father's. Crucially, Louis lacked the towering personality of his father. He was a meeker, more withdrawn man. However, Louis can't be blamed entirely for the ultimate fate of Charlemagne's empire. In some ways, this new empire was assembled rapidly, attempting to meld the concepts of ancient Rome with Frankish kingship. Had Louis had some of his father's natural gifts, this process of amalgamation might have continued, and even ultimately triumphed. As it was, the political unity of the empire would not be Charlemagne's enduring legacy. Other important aspects of Charles the Great's reign lived on. His empire revived the European world after centuries of decline in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Depopulated regions were once again inhabited and lively in agriculture and trade. Towns sprang back to life, and lands were resettled. Charlemagne also greatly expanded the Latin Christian world, though often through brutal warfare, as in the case of the Saxons. This laid the groundwork for medieval Europe, which would, in its essence, be Frankish. The growth of towns and trade during Charlemagne's reign would leave a lasting impact. He built new roads, which facilitated safe travel. Increased wealth led to revived arts and crafts, learning and literature. Painters, sculptors, ivory carvers, goldsmiths, and other artists and craftsmen found employment in Charlemagne's empire. Some of these men came from Rome, Constantinople, and even Baghdad, leading to a fertile cross-pollination of modes and ideas. Charlemagne's patronage of learning would endure far beyond his death. His grandsons and great-grandsons would continue to attract poets, scholars, and philosophers to their courts. The schools established in Frankish monasteries during Charlemagne's reign would continue to preserve ancient texts and foster a love of learning. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Charlemagne's reign would be the impact of his figure upon the imagination of medieval civilization. He would come to be the model of kingship. Stories were told and retold of his generosity to the poor, his justice as a judge, his gallantry as a warrior, and his fervor as a Christian. Kings and emperors would emulate him, and churchmen would point to him as an example. Even today, his memory endures as an icon of monarchy. In 816, only 2 years after Charlemagne's death, Pope Leo III, who had crowned him emperor, also died. The new pope, Stephen V, travelled to France almost immediately, intent on maintaining the traditional alliance between emperor and pope. At the time, Louis the Pious was presiding over a council of church reform at Aachen, where the rule of Saint Benedict was made the standard for monasteries throughout the empire. From there, Louis travelled to Reims, where he met with Pope Stephen. "Blessed be the Lord our God," the Pope proclaimed, "who has given me to see with my eyes a second King David." That Sunday, the Pope crowned Louis as emperor using a jeweled crown said to have belonged to Constantine. Louis's wife, Ermengarde, was crowned as empress. In 817, Louis named his eldest son, Lothaire, his sole successor. This was an important step and showed that Louis was conscious of the need to maintain the integrity of his father's empire. But in keeping with Frankish tradition, Louis did provide lands for his other two sons, Pepin and Louis. In October 818, the Empress Irmingarde died suddenly. Louis, a man who throve on the support of those closest to him, was devastated. At first, he was inconsolable, but then, in early 819, he married Judith, daughter of Count Welf of Bavaria. Judith was much younger than the emperor, astoundingly beautiful and ambitious. She began to exert a decisive influence on her husband. In 823, she bore him a son, Charles, named for his legendary grandfather. Judith at once began to pursue the political interests of her child. That Easter, Lothaire was crowned co-emperor and king of Italy, but after conferring with his father, he agreed to grant a territory to his 4-month-old half-brother Charles. Although this seemed like a minor concession, it revealed the pliability of Louis's will. The domain assigned to baby Charles contained parts of Bavaria, Switzerland, and Burgundy on both banks of the Rhine, all territory Lothaire had expected to rule himself. Louis sent Lothaire away to rule Italy and stopped including his eldest son's name on official decrees. Meanwhile, one of Judith's favourites, Bernard of Septimania, was appointed Chamberlain, the most important imperial office. It seemed that Louis was taking the imperial succession away from Lothair and either preparing to name Charles as his heir or to create some sort of equal division of the empire. Many of the Frankish bishops and nobles were alarmed by these developments and understood that this could lead to the collapse of the empire. Amid this increasing uncertainty, Louis's second and third sons, Pepin and Louis, launched their own revolt, supported by many of Charlemagne's surviving advisors. The brothers seized their father and stepmother Judith and drove the Chamberlain Bernard into Spain. Imprisoned by his sons, the Emperor Louis was forced to cancel his most recent division of the realm and restore the terms of 817. However, after he was freed, Louis convened an assembly in October, calling on all loyal men to rally to him. He released Judith and restored his government. In 831, he formally deprived Lothair of the title of co-emperor and divided his empire among his 4 sons. The Archbishop Agobard of Lyon wrote a scathing critique of this revival of the old policy of division. Subsequent events would prove the wisdom in the Archbishop's words. Pepin soon rebelled again. Louis defeated him, imprisoned him, and gave his inheritance to Charles. But in 833, Pepin escaped and formed an alliance with his brothers Lothair and young Louis. Supported by the Archbishop Agobard, the brothers assembled an army and met the forces of their father along the Rhine. Pope Gregory IV travelled up from Rome to try to mediate between father and sons. For 5 days, the Emperor and the Pope discussed the issue, but the Emperor's support was collapsing. More and more of the nobility rallied to the sons of Louis the Pious. This was the culmination of Louis's fickle policies. The Frankish magnates no longer trusted the Emperor to maintain the stability of the empire. Indeed, Louis's sons argued that they were acting precisely to secure the integrity of the realm. Ultimately, Louis's support so collapsed that he had to surrender to his sons. Lothair, Pepin, and young Louis declared their father deposed. Judith and Charles were taken from him. Pope Gregory IV returned to Rome, deeply disturbed. Alliances continued to shift. Pepin and young Louis began to mistrust their older brother and returned to the camp of their father. Louis the Pious was restored to power in 834, rejoined by Judith and his youngest son Charles. But the empire was far from stable, and fighting continued to break out among various factions of the imperial family. Louis was powerless to stop the destruction of his inheritance. In 840, he died, a broken man of 62, amidst yet another campaign against his disloyal sons. With his death, any semblance of the old united empire of Charlemagne died as well. Their father gone, the sons of Louis the Pious would battle each other.
Now, check out our video about Queen Morphia and King Baldwin II, a Crusader power couple who won many epic battles in the Holy Land during the Crusades era. Click on the link on your screen or in the description below to watch the video covering their story.